Hey, James Watson here. I want to go over a couple of things that process I make. It's no secret. It's probably the same thing 99 out of 100 people do when they're talking about fishing a jig and fishing a jig around boat docks. We'll just go over from start to of the process of building the jig to what equipment I use to application on the water around boat docks, particularly today. That's what we're going to talk about. But one of the things that helped me win the PAA on Table Rock in September of this year was the fact that I was versatile enough to pick up a jig and flip it around boat docks and catch a few key fish that helped me win that tournament. And this is a process that I went through. In that particular time of year, I don't focus very deep on flipping a jig around deep boat docks. I would focus my efforts on the fronts, or what I call the front is what's touching closest to the bank. That's the front of a boat dock to me. And I'd take that jig and I would flip it to the fronts on the shallowest side of the boat docks to include the walkways, if they had a float along the walkway, or a tree or a stump that was between the dock and the bank. Those are the things I would focus on, and you could flip this jig up there. And what I like to do when I'm flipping a jig is I like to use a War Eagle, a 3/8 ounce War Eagle heavy finesse jig. It gives me a big enough and heavy enough of a hook that I can really hammer a bass just like if I was flipping a lay down or a bush. I take my War Eagle jigs, and this is something my stepdad likes to do this for me, and he'll paint eyeballs on it because I'm a firm believer, and I think all my lures should have eyes on them so that they can see the bass and go after the bass and not always count on the bass to come after them. You see where I'm going out with this? So eyeballs on my War Eagle jig get applied after my purchase of my War Eagle heavy finesse jig. So I take my heavy finesse jig. I believe this color is Missouri Crawl, which is pretty popular. It's got 4 strands of chartreuse in it that's dynamite, especially if you got a little bit tint to the water. And I take my War Eagle heavy finesse jig before or after I tie it on, and I take my baby Guido bug. And here's something I like to do with my baby Guido bug is this one I trimmed too much off the pinchers, but I like to give it a little more action. So I take my scissors. See, it's all the stupid things bass fishermen do, and then we tell our buddies, and it's no longer a secret. It's like, man, Watson caught them fish because he did that to his baby Guido bug. Maybe not, I doubt it. So maybe it's just because your buddy caught him because he actually put the lure in front of a fish. So you take that. I always moisten up the hook just a little bit if it's not wet already. And I'll use sometimes I cut a portion of this baby Guido bug off. You might use another trailer like Zoom makes a critter crawl. Bass Pro makes a good plastic little crawdad. I use a pack of chunk sometimes, but the baby Guido bug's my favorite. I might cut some of that off sometimes, but today I'm not, just for visual aids. And what's great about this heavy finesse jig, other than it's got a superior weed guard that's got enough take to it, but it's not so forgiving that you get hung up all the time. It's got that heavy hook, and look at that keeper on the lead collar there, the barb on that collar, which allows me to weed my chunk up there. I took a little bit too much. Weed my chunk up there like so. Voila, now we got a good looking crawdad. Notice the spider wire, or the out flared jig up here. I like that when I'm doing boat docks versus bushes and laydowns where I use a regular full-size jig. So I take that there, and now I'm going to take since we're going shallow, we're going on the front end of these docks, and yeah, it's ultra clear water too, don't get me wrong, but I do not approach a front of a boat dock. I don't care what the water temperature is, how clear or how dirty it is. I never approach the front end of a boat dock without 20-pound maximum fluorocarbon. If you go up there in that shallow water with anything less than 20-pound fluorocarbon, you're wrong. You're asking to get broke off. You're asking to lose that one fish that could have won you the tournament. You're asking for it, so don't do it. So you carry a rod that you might be flipping 10 and 12 pound in clear stalls and deeper water with a little jig. put that rod down and you grab this rod when you go to the front of the dock because something looks good. Your mind's going, something looks good. Let's go up there and flip that. Well, if your mind's telling you to go up there and flip that, guess what? You better go up there and flip that. So that's how you win tournaments. That's how you put money in your pocket. So go flip it, but don't take a little pansy rod that you've been flipping with in the empty stalls in 25 foot of water and go up there on a shallow float with cables and logs and dead bodies and everything else that you like to flip around and expect to wrestle some 5-pound bass or bigger out of that water with 10 and 12 pound line. Go with 20. So I'm gonna tie, it's called a polymer knot. So I make sure my line's good, I check it real good, I feel for any abrasions and such. And then some people don't pinch their line, I just pinch my line because I'm lazy. Fishermen sometimes get lazy, and I run it through the eye of the hook as such, and I bring it out. Look at that. I take that, and I just make one knot, like such, and I take that, and I loop it through as such, and I'm still got the loop here, and I like to moisten to keep the friction down. Moisten that up a little bit, and I slowly pull that together. Now, everybody's got their own way of tying knots, tying different knots for different line. But for me, the polymer knot, I broke off less fish tying a polymer knot than a double hangman's knot. I don't know what they call that, improved cinch or something like that. But I break off more if I'm tying that knot versus a polymer with fluorocarbon. I don't know what it is. So that bait's ready to go. I mean, it's ready for action. I team it up with my big 7.5 foot. This particular rod's my Team Daiwa Light and Tough series that they don't make anymore, that I've grown so fond of. And I team it up with my Pro Qualifier, Bass Pro Qualifier, 7-to-1, 7-to-1. What'd I say? 7-to-1. How fast? 7-to-1 gear ratio reel. Now, why do I want a 7-to-1 gear ratio reel? Because when you're in hand-to-hand combat, you don't want anything to go slow. You don't want your bullets to go slow, you don't want your bayonet to go slow, and you damn sure don't want your reel to go slow when you're in hand-to-hand combat. So you're 7-to-1 reel, so you can flip it up there and crank that bass. The minute he bites, you jack him and you get him in the boat as fast as possible. And the more line you can tank with every crank, the better off you are. So that's why I use a 7-to-1 reel a lot, whether I'm buzz baiting, flipping, pitching. I don't do it crankbaiting, but I do when I'm going hand-to-hand, and I consider this hand-to-hand combat. So that rod and reel is ready to go. 20-pound Maxima fluorocarbon, 7-to-1 gear ratio, Pro Qualifier reel. Did you know you can get these reels most of the time at Bass Pro, catch them on sale for $80 a piece? That's crazy. You have no idea how old this reel is. You can probably look at it and tell. It's probably 3 years old and I'm still using it. You can't beat them up. The next jig tactic I like to use is swimming a jig. Now, swimming a jig is very effective, you know what, basically throughout the year except the cold water situations. So I like to swim a jig, and if I'm, excuse me, if I'm swimming a jig around boat docks and heavy cover, a lot of times, well, more than half the time, I'll swim that jig using 65-pound braided line. Now, a lot of people use a fluorocarbon line, but I like to use braided line when I'm swimming a jig, especially around boat docks, because you're flipping it in there and you're reeling it fairly fast. So your line's not going to be, it's not going to play a role in whether that fish is going to eat your jig or not. So you get away with, again, the biggest line you possibly can. So I like to swim a jig with 50 to 65-pound braid. And when I swim a jig around boat docks, all I use, it's not rocket science. It's just a jig. This is a War Eagle flipping jig. Now, what I do to my War Eagle flipping jig, if I'm going to be swimming it, what I do to my flipping jig is I take the weed guard, which is pretty awesome. I probably don't need to, but I do. I take it and I trim about half of that weed guard away. There it is. Because really all it's going to get hung on is a fish's face or a bar or something like that. So I trim that down so when them fish swim out from underneath that and make a turn on my jig, that they got a really good chance of getting hooked with that big old heavy hook. So I'll take that, and I love throwing swim jig with rattles. Now, in grass situations, a little bit different. I'll use a swim jig instead of a flipping jig. But for today's purposes, I'm going to use this jig like I do around boat docks, a flipping jig, and I'm going to take a Zoom. Don't get mad at me, Lucky Strike, but this is an awesome crawl to put on the back of a swim jig. This is a Zoom speed crawl, not the Ultra Vibe, but the big one. And if you can see when we video this, how good this thing thumps when I put this jig on here. Now this I do have to trim up because I don't want that bass having a large target to decide on. So I want to slim that profile down where them legs are just back behind my skirt kicking, and they don't have a whole lot to choose from. You give them too long of a target, and sometimes I'm guilty of it when I'm like throwing a chatterbait or something with a fluke on it, or a Lucky Strike little jerk or something like that. But there's this ultimate swim jig set up right there for boat docks. Again, I like the bigger jig like this in boat dock situations because it's got the heavy hook on it, and I throw it on 50 to 65 pound Maxima braid. Now Maxima braid's pretty awesome. If you can see how limp that is, you can see just by looking at it how soft and limp that this line is. And I tie polymer knot for it too. Others got their own way. It works for me. So I tie that old jig on there like such, and I get it ready to go. Now, you got to remember, you have no stretch with braided line. So when these bass get it, they get it. And you're going to jack their heads into the boat so fast they won't even know that they eat this jig out of your hand. So there we are, we're ready to go. Now, if I could have my trusty assistant again, and guess what kind of reel am I using? I'm using a Bass Pro reel, of course, because they're pretty freaking awesome, and it's a 7-to-1 Carbon Light reel. I like the Carbon Light series when I'm throwing like buzz baits and such. I just happened to pick this Carbon Light up because it had the braid on it. Most of my Carbon Light reels are braided up instead of fluorocarbon. So this jig is now ready to go. It's rattles, where I don't use rattles in grass very often. It's rattled up, ready to go. And I'm going to get my trusty assistant, Travis P. Rott from True Image Promotions. His cinematography skills are second to none. And I'm going to have him launch me here. And we're going to go apply this around some of these boat docks and see if this boat dock marina guy will come out and run me off. He's going to think I'm catching his pets. Let's go try it.